Hello, I'm David Caputo, Professor of Political Science at Pace University in New York City, and I'd like to welcome you to the Road to the White House. It is the MOOC that I am teaching, Massive Open Online Course. I'm happy to have you with us today. Today I'm going to be talking about Super Tuesday. Okay, not quite the Super Bowl, but in many respects it is a Super Bowl for the candidates. It's not the last event, but it's certainly one of the first main events. As I mentioned, when I finished the discussion about South Carolina and Nevada, I mentioned that we're now moving on to a phase in the nominating process where things are really going to settle into, I think, somewhat of a routine, and it will be very interesting to see what that routine is and what it implies. So why is Super Tuesday, March 1st, why is Super Tuesday so important? One, you have a large number of delegates being selected in both parties. Number two, you're only 13 days away after March 1st to a change in the Republican rules. Through March 13th, any caucus or any primary has to have a proportional basis. After March 13th, states can have a winner-take-all system if that's what they want to do. And we'll talk more specifically about that as we move on to the second. After March 1st, some contests March 8th, but March 15th are the next most important ones. Now, for the Republicans, approximately 550 delegates are going to be chosen. You need 1,237. So if someone were to run the table with these 550 delegates, they'd be very close. They'd be more than halfway with the delegates that they already have to being on their way to the Republican nomination. Now, what states, I put behind me is a map. This is a good test for your geography to see if you can readily find these states without having to look at the map. But in terms of states and delegates, okay, Alabama, 50. Alaska has caucuses, and they'll be sending 28. Arkansas, 40. Colorado has caucuses. Massachusetts has a primary with 42. Minnesota with 38 caucuses. Oklahoma, 43. Tennessee, 58. Texas, 155. 155. Okay. Vermont, 16. Virginia, 49. And Wyoming has precinct caucuses with 29. So that's approximately 550. So the total number of delegates that the Republicans need to win the nomination is 1,237. So now the interesting question here is, what is going to happen? What the Super Tuesday does, to some extent, it forces the candidates to move away from the so-called retail politics, which they can have in the first three races because they could concentrate their energy and resources on those states, into trying to decide which states are likely to be more fertile ground for them and which states are they going to concentrate their resources in. Remember again, the results are proportional. So it's important that you poll high enough to get across that proportional bar, which in some states will be 20%, some states will be 15%. Don't get across the proportional bar, you get no delegates, either in the district or in the state. So that's very important. So if you were Donald Trump, where would you concentrate? I think Trump is going to argue that he's concentrating on every single state. His style of political campaigning, i.e. large rallies, means that he can fly into major cities in each of these states, give a rally, move on to another state. So in many respects, this type of arrangement, and it's called the Southeast Conference because of the area of the country that is emphasized the most, it favors him in the extent that he, unless the others have an extensive ground organization, he's able to monopolize and depend upon the media. Now, for Ted Cruz, Texas is obviously critical. He's a senator from Texas. We'll see how popular he is in Texas. People will have a choice between he and the other candidates. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. The other candidates, no one claims any sort of specific link to these states in terms of having represented them or whatnot. So remains to be seen what happens here. But I think the important point is that Trump is in position even getting 30 to 40% of the vote in these states, he's in position to win them and to get the preponderance of delegates. So let's just say hypothetically that he were to get 400 or 350 to 400 of the 550 delegates. That puts him well over 400 delegates, a third of the way. The closest candidate behind him would probably have no more than 100. So I think the dynamics of this as we go forward is likely to be, can the Republican opposition to Trump force this into the Republican convention and on the floor? And then on the floor of the convention, be able to nominate another person other than Donald Trump. High risk, but also high reward. I think it is very difficult, unless March 1st turns out to be a break-even, or that the two main opponents, Cruz and Rubio, are able to get more delegates in total than Donald Trump. And the other thing is, will we see in these southern states what we saw in some of the two early primaries and in the caucus, and that is basically a disdain for the establishment. I mean, who is the establishment candidate now? Clearly Marco Rubio, but John Kasich also likes to argue that he could be seen as the establishment candidate. So March 1st will be very interesting. It'll be more confusing to try to understand because of what's happening in so many different states and so many different rules and so forth. But nonetheless, delegate count now begins to emerge as far more important as to who wins these primaries and who comes in second or third. It's who's obtaining the delegates. Now for the Democrats. Democrats have a total of 1,050 delegates up for grabs. That's almost half what you need in order to win the nomination, where you need 2383. So for the Democrats, you have Alabama primary, 60. American Samoa doesn't get to vote in the presidential election, but they get to vote, they get to participate in the nominating process. 10 caucus delegates will be chosen there. Arkansas with 37, Colorado 79 caucus. Democrats abroad 17, Georgia 116, Massachusetts 116, Minnesota 93 chosen in caucus, Oklahoma 42, Tennessee 76, Texas 252 delegates. The Vermont is 26 and Virginia is 110. So let's just do a little regional analysis here. You would expect that Secretary Clinton would run well in Arkansas. You would expect she should run well in Georgia, and she should run well in perhaps Virginia and Tennessee. But Senator Sanders also has 3 caucus states, okay? Minnesota, Colorado, and a third state, Massachusetts, which is not a caucus state, a primary state, where you would expect him to run well. So that offsets some of that, and then you get into the other states where Texas is going to be a key battleground. Why? Because of the number of delegates that are there. Remember again, the Democrats go proportionately. So it's proportion statewide, and in terms of the statewide delegates, and it's proportion within each congressional district. So here, given the proportionality rule, organization is going to be critical. Organization is critical. And if the Clinton camp is able to replicate some of their earlier organization, they may have an advantage. Although Senator Sanders has an advantage in getting more and more people interested in the primaries and the caucuses, especially younger age individuals. And as those people participate or not, one of the interesting points that's coming up, although March 1st will be much greater on March 15th, many college students will be on break during this time. And they may be at home, although I think fewer students go home, but that may make it difficult for Sanders to be able to mobilize them as a group. So it remains to be seen. When you look at the number of delegates, when you consider, if you put in the superdelegates that are at least have tentatively pledged to Mrs. Clinton, you can see that Sanders really has to make up about 350 to 400 delegates by the time of the convention. So this is one of his best chances, 1,050 delegates. But if he and Mrs. Clinton basically split, then the deciding, and they split the delegates from this point on, the final decision will be made by the party leadership under the superdelegates. Okay? And those, at least to date, are heavily in favor of Secretary Clinton. So strategy and organization will be important. Potential impact on the race. If either of them, if either Senator Sanders or Secretary Clinton were to end up with 65 to 75% of the delegates at the end of the day, 600 to 700 delegates, I think it would make it very difficult for, if Mrs. Clinton ends up with that, it would make it very difficult for Sanders to really see a path to getting the nomination. And you would probably begin to get some calls for his stepping aside. I doubt if he will till after March 15th. And what if the situation is reversed? Clearly, Mrs. Clinton would argue she still would have the lead in terms of delegate count, but a much slimmer lead, and her job would be much harder going forward. So we're going to see a lot of interesting things. Remember, the one emphasis that Secretary Clinton has emphasized is that her support is in where we have state diversity. So you have that in a state such as Georgia, you have that in Arkansas, you have that in Alabama, but much less so in states such as Massachusetts, Oklahoma, and Texas. Okay? So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. Watch for the returns, watch how the media cover multiple state contests going on at the same time. They're going to have difficulty keeping the rules, statewide rules straight, both in the Democrat and the Republican. So March 1st is the first, I would argue, really the first of several Super Tuesdays, but this one is especially important for both the Democrats and the Republicans. Thank you.